Good morning. I'm Cheryl Mizell. Welcome to Community Voices, our weekly public affairs talk show that addresses issues and concerns in South Florida. Please text me with your thoughts, suggestions, or comments as you're listening to the show. On Facebook, Twitter, or MySpace, you'll find me listed as Cheryl Mizell, spelled CHERYLMIZELL. I look forward to hearing from you. This past week, 99 Jams Community Voices was on location at the Imagine Miami Meaningful Youth Engagement Interactive Workshop hosted by HSC Catalyst Miami and presented by Adam Fletcher, International Youth Engagement Expert. Before the workshop, I had a chance to sit down and talk to Adam to gain some insight on how to engage youth for positive action in our community. And here's that interview. Adam, tell us a little bit about your journey to understanding how to work with young people so well.
I think the place where I always start is that my work with young people began when I was a young person. When I was 14 years old, I had the opportunity to take a job as a drama instructor in a program working in Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha has a 19% African-American population, and my family was living homeless before we moved there. And we needed an inexpensive place to live, and it happened that that was the African-American community in Omaha, Nebraska. So I grew up a minority in a minority community. And the neighborhood nonprofit ran an outreach program that taught kids in Omaha's housing projects. At that time, it had 5 different housing projects. And this nonprofit taught kids in the projects drama as self-expression and self-empowerment. And so I was hired to be a teacher in this program and spent 3 summers teaching that. And I decided at that point that I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing that work. I just didn't know what that looked like. And so after that, I spent 15 years working in a variety of different nonprofits, different settings, doing different kinds of youth work. Anything to work with young people, though. Children and youth. And I kept finding that the programs angled towards a specific direction, and I didn't know what to name it. Eventually, I began to understand it as youth empowerment, but then that was still too nebulous, it was still too far-reaching. And eventually, I learned about this youth engagement movement, and I began to take root in that. And that was right around 2000. It was that year that I was hired by this Points of Light Foundation. It was George Bush Sr.'s 1,000 Points of Lights initiative, and part of it was focused on volunteerism, and part of that was focused on youth, and it was this question of how do we have youth meaningfully involved in volunteerism. Well, I decided to expand that out, build upon that, and instead of having the youth who are traditionally involved, let's get in the youth who are non-traditionally involved, young people who need more opportunities to become meaningfully involved in their communities, and that's really where the base of my work comes from.
Very interesting. So you got started in the hood, as we say.
That's right.
So here in South Florida, we've lost far too many of our youth to crimes, guns, and violence. And this is MLK weekend, and certainly we have to reflect on how to live in community and be able to use those principles and apply them the way Dr. King taught us. Certainly we have to be able to do that, but I'm just wondering, what can you tell us or what can you share with us that might be helpful in those communities where they've experienced a lot of this, that maybe there was something else that could have been done to engage those same youth that reached in and pulled out a weapon into doing something else with their time that took them in another direction to making full use of their talents in a positive way.
That's right. One of the things that Dr. King taught us was about building the army of nonviolence. He wanted to see the same kind of discipline, the same kind of membership, the same kind of focus and concentration on nonviolence that the Army has on violence. And so he incorporated and built this philosophy of the Army of Nonviolence into his work. And I believe in this Army, and I believe that it's actually being built today. Whether or not we're cognizant of it, it's largely irrelevant. What we know about gangs is that they provide membership. They provide belonging. They provide even purpose. And that there is so much brotherhood and sisterhood that happens inside of that environment that they aren't inherently negative aside from the violent work that they're embarked in. These same young people who join these gangs are looking for that opportunity for meaningful engagement in their own lives every single day. And so what I teach communities about and organizations about is how to create new opportunities for engagement that actually meaningfully meet these young people's desire for connection, purpose, belonging, and discipline in the way that Dr. King advocated for the nonviolent army. So in this way, we begin to see young people, instead of being negatives, instead of being problems to be fixed, We start to see them as resources and as possibilities to occur. We don't just give up simply because they're black, or they come from that neighborhood, or they don't have that much money, or they look like they never care. In reality, we start to see them as possibilities for transformation and for empowerment and for belonging and for purpose. And with that in mind, we can begin to resituate their roles. So we create new opportunities for self-expression that meet our needs as a society and a community. We begin to create new opportunities for engagement and belonging that meet our needs as a society and community. And we get these young people beyond seeing themselves as being the center of the world and instead help them see that they are part of an interdependent web, the way that Dr. King taught us. And so there's lots of concrete ways to make that happen, but as kind of an overview, that's the initial conception.
So, Adam, tell me about some of the projects where you've actually worked with people or worked with youth directly and seen those kinds of transitions.
My work has happened on both of that direct level and the indirect level. Working directly with young people, I've been responsible for creating arts and transition programs where young people who have been graffiti artists tagging streets illegally and making their name known to the world explicitly so that people can see it, but not necessarily legally, transitioning them from that to becoming self-engaged entrepreneurs who can turn their art into money for themselves and for their families, as well as socially engaged artists who are creating art for social benefit rather than just for themselves. So instead of just your name, what's your message? What's your point? What's your purpose? And really having that graffiti as art represented in a more holistic community sense. And then that's one of the best programs that I've ever been engaged in. Very powerful, very effective at getting these non-traditionally engaged youth into the meaningful community-oriented engagement programs. In a larger sense, some of the most powerful programs that I've seen have engaged young people, non-traditionally engaged youth, in transforming the institutions that are meant to serve them that have historically failed. So having young people become actors inside of the nonprofit organizations that serve them in decision-making, in evaluating, and planning. Huge efforts to do this work, very successful in a number of cities across the country. Having young people actually participate in school improvement, school reform efforts so that they can transform the educational institutions that are failing them en masse, and actually not just in a tokenistic way, not in a simplistic, we just want to hear youth for the sake of hearing youth, but actually getting them involved so that their voices have a substantive and real role that has very visible, tangible outcomes. We've seen that transformation happen. And then I think the third thing that I'd tell you about are youth-led community organizing and improvement efforts. So where young people have decided that they're not going to continue to wait for adults to change the world. Instead, they're going to step up, organize their peers, organize their parents, organize their communities, and actually take initiative on their own to step out. We've had a number of books here in the last 10 years that have been written on this idea of youth-led community organizing. We have organizations like the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing out of Brooklyn, and the Midwest Academy has done a little bit of work, and the Highlander Center in Tennessee has done a little bit of work. We have a number of these organizations that are really getting out there and pushing this idea, but I think the most important work is happening by youth leading themselves and leading their communities out of the very problems that they face the most. Youth are going to be the most effective leaders in that work. So we kind of got those three different layers going on, where it's direct service that's happening by nonprofits, it's direct work that's happening by youth workers and parents and community leaders, and then it's direct work that's being done by young people themselves. And it's all very powerful work that's really taking root to show not just a vision for youth engagement specifically, but actually community engagement as a whole. So we're actually transforming communities by engaging young people. It's very powerful work.
Absolutely. As you were talking, I was thinking, so a parent who's listening to this and they want to start right in their own living room, they have a kid who they're concerned about. What would you suggest be their first steps?
And that's a great question because it all begins in the family. Youth engagement's core is in the places where we grow up. And so I think that the first step that any parent can take is to change their mind right now. You know, lots of parents, they struggle to keep hope in their own kids. They do, but they struggle, and they struggle a lot. So change your mind. Instead of seeing hopelessness in your child, see hope in your child. Instead of seeing futurelessness, see the future in your young person. This is what our media has taught us over and over and over again, not to trust kids. They've demonized our young people. They've made particularly black and brown young men into super predators. And they're labeling and they're putting them into prison, and all of these things are happening every single day in worse and worse ways. Parents have an obligation to buck that trend. We've got to believe in our kids. That's the very first thing that any parent can do. Transform how you think right now. That much said, the next step is to challenge your kid to get in. Challenge them directly by having them engage in their own family, in their own house. This house, this family is part of you and you are part of it. Have your young person understand that they have a responsibility, not just for themselves. They don't need to just put food on their own plate when they turn 19. They need to start taking care of their house and their family right now, no matter what age they are, 14, 13, 17. They need to take responsibility in their family right now. As parents, we have responsibility to give that responsibility to our young people so they can experience it now before getting thrown out of the house when they're 18, before getting arrested for doing the crime because they all these things don't have to proceed that way. So as parents, we have an obligation to intervene in the negative future that society is painting for our young people. So there's two things right there. One is change your mind personally as a parent right now. Two is make new opportunities for your own kid in your own house right now. And then from there, the opportunities are unlimited. There are so many directions to take it. But first, we have to take responsibility for what we can change, and that's our own house and that's our own children.
You're right. Certainly giving kids more responsibility and holding them to it. Mm-hmm. That's the real key. I mean, a lot of parents, even working with their kids, they're not consistent. They'll say one thing one day and then they won't follow up. And that's really what hurts a child, is their inconsistency. That's what hurts them. I'm also curious to hear you talk a little bit about how you go about teaching adults to engage young people in these different settings.
So, like I said, family is the first place. And one of the ways that my work specifically goes directly to parents is by working directly with parents, doing parent workshops, and helping organizations that serve parents specifically begin to reconceive the way that parenting happens, so that instead of having young people be the passive recipients of parenting, we have them becoming active, engaged members of larger families. And there's a very fine line that's being drawn there. And that fine line has to do with the same thing that I teach organizations and that I teach communities. So beyond targeting families specifically and parents specifically, I work also with youth workers, with teachers, with all of these different sectors of our society that address young people. And I provide professional development directly to those people and organizations in order to transform the way that they're thinking about young people. And again, it's that question of where does responsibility play into it? Where does resiliency play into it? Where are appropriate adult-youth relationships? And I really tried to train out and teach out that this is in a way, it's a brand new way of thinking about youth. And in another way, it's a very, very old way of thinking about youth. You know, one of the things that Hillary Clinton got famous for was saying that it takes a village to raise a child. And I agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. But I think that the opposite is true as well. It takes children to raise our villages. Because without these young people, we ain't going to have any villages left. We need them to stay committed to their communities, whatever that community could be. It could be a hard physical neighborhood. It could be a racial or ethnic identity. It could be a cultural background or religious background. It could be any of these different kinds of communities, but we need our young people to commit and belong in these communities. And so what I do is work with these organizations and individuals within these organizations to help them see how they personally can transform the lives of young people, but also in turn how they can work within their structures and their systems to transform those systems to engage young people. So what we're talking about ultimately, and where the whole thing goes for me, is how do we as a society begin to re-envision roles for young people throughout society. It's not just on the shoulders of nonprofits. It's not just on the shoulders of parents. It's on the shoulders of every single person. We have these real problems that are happening in our society, and we have the energy and the capacity to address them if only we can engage that energy of young people. So it's working throughout society to actually make that happen.
That was part one of the interview with Adam Fletcher, international youth and community engagement expert, as well as workshop facilitator for HSC Catalyst Miami. I'm Cheryl Mizell, and this is 99 Jam's Community Voices.